The Egg and I, Part 3, Spring, beginning with a quote from Keats. Hear ye not the hum of mighty workings. Chapter 7, The Whistle Blows. Until I moved to the ranch, the coming of spring had been a gradual and painless thing, like developing a bust. In Butte, the snow melted and made torrents in the gutters. The streets didn't freeze at night. We found our first bluebell, and it was spring, and we can take off our, quote, shimaloons, end quote. In Seattle, the seasons ran together. Like the stained glass window paintings we did at school, where we wet the drawing paper first, all over, then dropped on blobs of different colors which ran into each other, so that it was impossible to tell where one began and the other left off. Seattle spring was a delicate flowering of the pale gray winter, a pastel prelude to the pale yellow summer which flowed gently into the lavender autumn and on into the pale gray winter. It was all very subtle, and as we wore the same clothes the year around and often had beach fires in January but found it too cold for them in June, we were never season conscious. Things were certainly different up on the ranch. Spring stopped there with a screech of brakes. Somewhere someone blew a whistle, and all hell broke loose. We awoke one morning to a new Sears Roebuck catalog. Baby chickens, thousands of them. A new little red-haired baby girl. Little yellow goslings, 2 baby pigs, a puppy, 2 kittens, a little heifer calf. Fruit trees snapping into bloom all over the place. A newly plowed plot for the biggest garden in the world. Streams and lakes brimming. Trilliums, wild violets, both purple and yellow, camas and starflowers carpeting the woods, fences to mend, seeds to plant, seed catalogs to dream through, government bulletins to choke down and digest, and no rest ever anymore. The spring sun, a bold-faced, full-blooded little wench, obviously no kin to the sallow creature who simpered in and out occasionally during the winter, bestowed her warm caresses impartially on the handsome virile timber, the tender plowed land, and the ugly, impotent burn. Every place she touched throbbed hopefully, and there was a rapidly spreading epidemic of pale green mustaches and beards. The mountains' noses began to run, and though they tied veils over their heads, they seemed less formidable. Bob announced that the big burn was going to have a bumper crop of wild strawberries, which was like telling me that Dracula was really somebody's mother. I was so ebullient from the sun and warmth that even the fact that I had to dog trot through the long days in order barely to scratch the surface of my thousands of new duties failed to dampen my ardor. Bob's spirits, never depressed by the dreary winter rains as mine had been, soared too. And in spite of the fact that for months I had been lifting him out of the abyss of my bad management with the bright hope that I would become marvelously efficient when working under pressure, and unfortunately we both found that, like the government, when given more bureaus to handle, I merely became more inefficient on a much larger scale. I had read of beauty-starved farm wives standing for an hour on their back stoops absorbing the glory of a sun-drenched branch of forsythia, walking in the orchards and burying their noses in the fragrant boughs, standing motionless in the warm spring sun and thanking God for the miracle of fertility. What I wanted to know was where they got the time for such ethereal pursuits. I saw the forsythia, I saw the apple blossoms, I saw the sun glancing over the emerald-tipped firs and pointing up the chartreuse maples and alders on its way. I saw those things, but I had about as much chance to linger and appreciate as I would have had riding a motorcycle through an art gallery. It all began with the baby chickens. They came first while I was still very pregnant, and getting down on my hands and knees to peer under the brooder at the thermometer was a major undertaking. Bob and I scrubbed the brooder house, walls, floors, even the front porch with Lysol and boiling water. The brooder house had 2 rooms, the brooder room and the cool room. In the brooder room, we had 2 coal oil brooders which we lit and checked temperatures on a week before the chicks arrived. The brooder room floor was covered with canvas and peat moss and had drinking fountains and little mash hoppers scattered here and there. The cooler room also had peat moss on the floor and buttermilk and water and fountains and mash hoppers here and there. At least the chicks arrived, and Bob drove down to Docktown and returned with 10 cartons with air holes along the sides, in each of which yeeped 100 chicks. We stacked the cartons in the cooler room, and then one by one, we carried them carefully into the brooder room, took off the lids and gently lifted out the little chicks and tucked them under the brooder, where they immediately set to work to suffocate each other. From that day forward, my life was one living hell. Up at 4, start the kitchen fire, put the coffee on, go out to the baby chicks, come back and slice off some ham and sling it into the frying pan, out to the baby chicks with warm water, put toast in the oven, out to the baby chicks with mash, set the breakfast table, out to the baby chicks with chick food, open a can of fruit, out to the baby chicks, and on through the day. I felt as if I were living a nightmare, fleeing down the track in front of an on-rushing locomotive. I raced through each day, leaving behind me a trail of things undone. Of course, I chose that most inconvenient time to have a baby, and her arrival quite typified the tempo of our life. I rode the 50-odd miles to town, sitting on her head, and the moment I reached the hospital, she popped out, red-haired and weighing 8.5 pounds. When I came home from the hospital after 2 weeks of blissful rest, everything on the ranch had been busy producing, and I was greeted by the squealing of baby pigs, the squeaking of baby goslings, the baaing of a heifer calf, the mewing of tiny kittens, the yelping of a puppy, and the stronger, louder yeeping of the chicks. All of the small, often screamers were assigned to my care, and I found that feeding of them all, and Bob and me, was a perpetual task. I relegated my ironing to something I would try and finish before small Anne entered college. My washing I tried to ignore, although it assumed the proportions of a snowball rolled from the top of Mount Olympus. And I closed my eyes to Spring, who was imploring me from every side to do something, anything, about my garden. Bob's life was as harried, and our marriage became a halloo, from the brooder house porch to the manure pile, a call for help when pulling a stump or unrolling some wire, a few grunts at mealtime as we choked down our food and turned the leaves of seed catalogs and government bulletins. One night after dinner, as I sat at the kitchen table industriously making my baby chick, quote, feed and death, end quote, entries for the day, Bob unexpectedly kissed the back of my neck. I was as confused as though an old boss had chosen that means of rewarding me for a nice typing job. Another year or two and we probably won't even use first names, I told Bob.